Good evening and welcome to the National Archives. My name is Kimberly Reed and I'm our Public Programs Coordinator. Before I introduce our speaker this evening, there are a few housekeeping items I need to note. If you have a cell phone with you, would you please take that out? Turn it to off or vibrate so that it does not go off during the presentation. In addition, if you need to use restroom facilities, just walk out the doors right behind you and turn to your right. You may have noticed additional lights and cameras with us this evening. Tonight, our program is being taped for C-SPAN. Please check your local listings for more information as it will air at a later date. Tonight, we are pleased to present our program in partnership with the Gay and Lesbian Archives of Mid-America and the Truman Center, both located at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. In addition, the Truman Presidential Library is one of our partners this evening. Copies of tonight's book by Dr. Douglas Charles will be available for purchase after the program, and I know that he would be happy to autograph those for you. And we thank the University Press of Kansas for being with us tonight and providing those. Before I introduce our speaker, I do want to point out to you that there is a microphone located right in the middle of the audience this evening. At the end, when we get to the question and answer portion of the program, please step up to the mic so that we can record your question for our viewers at home, as this will air later on in the year. Dr. Douglas Charles is Associate Professor of History at Penn State University, Greater Allegheny. He's the author of J. Edgar Hoover and the Anti-Interventionists, FBI Political Surveillance and the Rise of the Domestic Security State, 1939 and 1945. And his other book is the FBI's obscene file, J. Edgar Hoover and the Bureau's Crusade Against Smut. Tonight, we will hear from him as he regales us with information in his third book, which is Hoover's War on Gays, exposing the FBI's Sex Deviates program. Please welcome Dr. Charles.
Thank you very much. J. Edgar Hoover. There he is. J. Edgar Hoover. When one hears the name J. Edgar Hoover, two images usually come to mind. The first is the long-serving FBI director with his vaunted files targeting communists and leftists, using his files to get his way oftentimes with politicians. The second image is of a secretive man festooned in a black cocktail dress and feather boa, wearing high heels and sashaying around Washington, D.C. with his secret lover and Associate FBI Director Clyde Tolson. One of those is verifiable, based on verifiable, accessible historical evidence. The other is not. But nevertheless, it has become an irrepressible cultural meme rooted in innuendo, sexual stereotype, and supposition. Yet, both images still capture the two major Hoover-era obsessions, and they were obsessions, communists and gays. Until now, the FBI's preoccupation with gays, the nature of it, and the means by which it targeted gays has not been very well documented and examined only in limited ways. Otherwise, popularly at least, public discourses over the FBI and gays often center on the idea of a gay Hoover targeting his own through some kind of overcompensation. The fact of the matter is, we don't know. We cannot know what his sexuality was. That is, unless we're willing to use stereotyping somehow as evidence of a person's character or nature. So not knowing, having no convincing evidence, means Hoover's sexuality as a causal factor in explaining why his FBI targeted gays for some 40 years simply isn't helpful to an historical understanding of what the FBI actually did. So let me take you on a whirlwind tour of my book. I cannot cover everything, of course, but that allows you plenty of time to read it. And it's 400 pages, so you need the time. Overall, the book surveys the evolution of the FBI's targeting, obsession, and politics surrounding gays and lesbians from the mid-1930s to the mid-1990s. Why did it start in the 1930s? Why did it start during the Great Depression? It started then because Americans reassessed gender roles. They also reassessed their perceptions of those gender roles, particularly when it came to people attracted to those of the same sex. Prior to the 1930s, in fact, Americans did not regard homosexuality as something serious, as a serious threat, as something necessitating a systematic federal response. Instead, it was regarded as an individual sinful act, an aberration, and nothing overly concerning. But after the stock market crash in 1929 and after the Great Depression set in by 1930, Americans reassessed those views. In patriarchal, masculine American culture, as the previously valued husband, father, head of household suddenly failed to fulfill his assigned role, he lost his job, he could no longer pay the bills, couldn't care for his children, lost his home, became homeless, Americans changed their views about gender. If the ideal heterosexual man was failing socially and culturally, gays, who already stood outside expectations for men, were suddenly regarded as a serious threat. Moreover, after a series of child kidnappings and murders during the mid-1930s, gay men in particular were singled out as dangerous, predatory animals. Now, for the FBI, it started just after Christmas, 1936, when 10-year-old Charles Mattson was kidnapped, abused, brutalized, and murdered. Depression-era child kidnappings, murders were nothing new. Perhaps we're all familiar with the 1932 Charles Lindbergh kidnapping and murder. But in this instance, one, there had been a reevaluation of gender roles, and two, Hoover had declared an end to child kidnappings in 1935 and now looked foolish. Even more, the story shocked Americans from coast to coast and even led President Franklin Roosevelt to publicly promise the FBI would never stop until the killer was captured. Now, Hoover, a conservative bureaucrat holdover from the Republican Calvin Coolidge and Herbert Hoover administrations, now had to react because, one, his liberal boss, FDR, publicly demanded it, and if he wanted to retain his job, he would do what was needed, and two, he had to rectify his previously specious claims about child kidnappings. So the Hoover FBI significantly mobilized to solve this particular case. FBI agents focused on finding a quote-unquote sex offender. At the time, popular perception had it that gay men targeted children. So that is whom they focused on most, and in particular, they actually focused on hobos. Now, transients, hobos, were the most visible and iconic symbol of the Great Depression. But almost forgotten today, at the time, it was widely believed that sexual perversion was common in the hobo community, mainly because hobos commonly traded sexual favors for food or money. FBI agents not only focused on hobos, they also focused on ex-convicts, who similarly at the time were perceived to be a population among whom homosexuality was common. FBI agents finally focused on mental patients, given the view that homosexuality was a psychiatric disorder, and in total, investigating all of these avenues, FBI agents had eliminated a staggering 24,000 subjects, yet never solved the Mattson case. A significant thing happened here. For the first time, the FBI began a systematic monitoring of gays, which happened to fit a larger pattern of the federal government during the New Deal coming to discover homosexuality and attempting to regulate it. For the first time, because New Deal programs and New Deal government bureaucrats were working directly with common Americans to effect depression relief, they found themselves weeding gays out of those New Deal programs, which always had a family focus. While the FBI failed to solve the case, thus failing to satisfy President Roosevelt's public promise, it nevertheless had collected volumes of information about sex offenders. To achieve some level of success in this area, Hoover used that information in an educational campaign. If he couldn't solve the Mattson murder, and they investigated it all the way through the 1980s, by the way, he could warn and educate the American public about the threat of gays. This also fit the period. In 1935, Hoover's FBI created its Crime Records Division. Now, this is the FBI's public relations arm, which famously propagated the idea that morally upstanding, professional FBI agents used scientific investigative techniques and always captured their prey. By 1936, 1937, the FBI shifted that public relations effort and began focusing on educating Americans about the threat of domestic fascists and communists and other subversive influences like sex offenders. It was only a few years after 1937 when the FBI's perceptions and targeting of gays evolved. With the advent of World War II within the United States, suddenly the perception of gays evolved from being a being perceived as a criminal threat to children to being a national security threat. Why? Because if a gay man or woman was found in government, particularly holding an influential position, they could be targeted by subversive elements into betraying wartime secrets, leading to wartime failure and the loss of military lives, or so the argument went. Thus, we see for the Second World War period, the FBI investigating homosexuality among top government officials, either because of stories of sexual impropriety or because they were gay-baited by political enemies. These included Undersecretary of State Sumner Welles, who famously got drunk on a train and solicited sex from the male African-American train porters. It included Senator David Walsh, chair of the Committee on Naval Affairs, who was gay-baited because he didn't fit the mold of a man's man at the time and was accused of frequenting a gay brothel in New York City that allegedly was targeted by Nazi agents. It finally included the Lend-Lease coordinator in Moscow, General Philip Faymonville, who also didn't fit the common masculine mold of the time. He hated sports and he liked music. Leading his political enemies to gay-bait him because he worked closely and successfully with the Soviets, whereas his political enemies failed and they hated the Soviets. By the Cold War era, the FBI's interest in gays evolved yet again. It was similar to 1937 in that then, economic disaster had led to a new perception of gays. And now, with the Cold War, after the Second World War, the rise of the Soviet Union as a superpower, the threat of nuclear annihilation, and fears of domestic subversion led to another focus on gays as threats. And again, it coincided with a second sex crime panic in which Americans perceived children being targeted for murder. This time, gays were seen as both a threat to the Cold War home front and as a subversive threat because communist agents supposedly could blackmail any in government into betraying their country. Particularly, gays were seen as medical, criminal, and moral, quote-unquote, deviants. A popular magazine article in 1950 claimed to reveal the truth about homosexuality, arguing that gays sought to recruit children into their deviancy. Not just boys, all children. The article quoted one so-called expert on gays, quote, "All too often, we lose the sight of the fact that the homosexual is an inveterate seducer of the young of both sexes, and that he presents a social problem because he is not content with being degenerate himself. He must have degenerate companions and is ever seeking younger victims." End quote. Another text from the time on sexuality claimed because gays were a shunned part of society, quote, "The homosexual will murder his victim during an act of sexual frenzy and afterwards rob him." There quickly evolved a decidedly public witch hunt for gays in the 1950s, one that was similar to, yet distinct from, the witch hunt for communists in government. Today, the gay witch hunt is known as the Lavender Scare. The State Department had already begun purging gays from its ranks in 1947, and the public witch hunt began in 1950 after Senator Joseph McCarthy singled out two cases not of political subversion, but sexual subversion in the State Department, which led the State Department to purge itself of gays, very quickly firing 91. Soon after this, Americans focused on the topic, and it engrossed them for years. One American wrote President Truman, quote, "If the State Department can acquire and harbor 91 homosexuals who presumably had something to do with shaping our foreign policy or slanting the information on which it is based, the State Department is capable of anything." The Lavender Scare actually long outlived the Red Scare. In short order, J. Edgar Hoover's FBI responded. It had to respond. It was responsible for domestic security and responsible for protecting Americans from subversive influences. To demonstrate to the president the FBI was on top of the issue, in April 1950, Hoover forwarded to the White House a list of 393 people arrested in the Capitol for quote-unquote sexual irregularities. Concurrently, Hoover created the first version of the FBI Sex Deviates program. This one was based upon arrest records and fingerprint records. Anytime a person was arrested on a morals charge, which is soliciting gay sex, his arrest record and fingerprints were forwarded to the FBI, who then forwarded them to the Civil Service Commission. This limited program didn't work very well. The Civil Service noted many irregularities and errors in the FBI effort, and this was compounded by 2 Senate committees forming at the time to investigate the gays in government issue. First, there was the Wary Committee, which was very short, only 2 senators were on it, and afterwards came the much more significant Huey Committee. Both of them popularized the lavender scare, energized it, and led it to become commonplace. With all of these pressures, Hoover was forced to reconsider and dramatically expand his Sex Deviates program, and he did so by June 1951. The reconfigured Sex Deviates program moved beyond fingerprint and arrest records to include collecting any and all information about gays, including simple allegations. The information would be collected, compiled, have FBI source information added to it, and then be disseminated widely across government to ensure gays and lesbians were fired from their jobs. In time, recipients outside of government were added, including police departments and universities. Actually, today is the 60th anniversary of the FBI writing in a memo that, yes, we sent this to universities. That's today. The program was neither authorized by the Attorney General or the White House. Instead, it was an obsequious FBI effort squarely placing Hoover and the FBI in the vanguard of the lavender scare. The FBI's careful effort can be seen in how gay-related information was disseminated. When forwarding information to the Civil Service Commission, House of Representatives, or the Senate, including the Library of Congress and the Botanical Gardens, FBI policy mandated the use of FBI letters. Well, this is actually the document about the universities today, and that is an FBI letter. Now, particular FBI documents mean different things. FBI letters are clearly identified as being from the FBI. The FBI seal is on there, there's a signature on there, it's very clear where the information is coming from. So that tells us something. So when forwarding information to Congress, because they're in the forefront of the lavender scare, right, it's clear where the information is coming from. When forwarding information to the Government Accounting Office, Government Printing Office, the judicial branch, or the military branches, FBI policy mandated the use of something called blind memos. Now, I'll explain this one in a second. Blind memoranda are documents with no letterhead, no signature, no watermark, nothing revealing the FBI as a source. Now, this is actually a blind memo. This one happens to be redacted, but as you can see, the target's name is on there, Carmel Offee, dates on there, sexual allegations, which are blacked out, but otherwise, there's no indication this is from the FBI. Don't worry, because I found this. The first one was actually from an FBI file, blacked out. This one came from the Eisenhower Library. Now, in this case, they sent the exact document to the president, so it actually has the FBI seal on it. So this isn't actually a blind memo. But in here, what we find out is Carmel Offee, who worked for the CIA, was arrested in the park across the street from the White House for soliciting gay sex. Beyond this, FBI supervisors were directed to index from all reports, letters, memos, newspapers, and other sources all names of suspected, quote-unquote, sex deviates. They would do this by underlining the name with a green pencil. Central then to this FBI dissemination and purging effort was a comprehensive FBI file, the Sex Deviates file. The file actually constituted several files. One was a file on sex offenders dating from 1937. Another was captioned Sex Perverts in Government Service dating from 1942. A third, called Sex Deviates in Washington, D.C., contained all the fingerprint and arrest records the city police forwarded to the FBI. A fourth was held in the FBI's Washington field office until it was made obsolete in 1953. A fifth, so-called research file, captioned Sex Degenerates and Sex Offenders, constituted the information the FBI's Crime Records Division, its public relations arm, would use to educate and influence the public about the threat of so-called sex deviates. Even more, FBI field offices in cities with large gay and lesbian populations, such as San Francisco, maintained so-called research files in which they kept information about gays in their particular locations. In total, by 1977, the FBI's Sex Deviates file and related files had grown to be hundreds of thousands of pages in size. I would estimate the main file and related files probably upwards of 500,000, 500,000 pages. I don't have the time here to cover all government officials the FBI targeted, but that's why I wrote a 400-page book. Suffice it to say, some included the aforementioned Carmel Offey, presidential candidate Adlai Stevenson, president of Bradley University David Owen, Arthur Vandenberg Jr., major Republican name, State Department official Charles Thayer, he's there on the left, and Voice of America employee Nicholas Nabokov in the middle. State Department official and future ambassador to the Soviet Union, Charles Bolin. State Department official Samuel Reber. The Federal Security Agency itself, forerunner to the Department of Health and Human Services. 3 low-level Eisenhower White House Correspondence Office staffers, journalists Joseph and Stuart Alsop, among many, many others associated with all of these individuals. In reality, because the FBI Sex Deviates file was destroyed in 1977, 1978, we can never know exactly how many people were targeted. This merely constitutes a tiny sampling. Concurrent with the FBI's hunt for gays in government during the start of the Lavender Scare, FBI agents also targeted the first and early gay rights groups on the West Coast. The Mattachine Society, there's the cover page for the FBI file. Another group was called One Incorporated, which had an eponymous magazine, which you see here. And the lesbian group Daughters of Galitas. Here they are looking very subversive. Mattachine was the first of the so-called homophile groups to form, advocating uniting gays, educating the public, and activist politics. By 1952, Mattachine had caught the attention of a local journalist who, given the Lavender Scare events in Washington, questioned whether a communist spy could infiltrate the group and, quote, swing tremendous political power. The public charges initiated an FBI investigation under its Common Fill program of Mattachine and One to see if communists indeed had infiltrated the groups. Checking all sources from local police departments, credit bureaus, post offices, and interviewing informants, the FBI decided after months of investigation that both groups were clean. Now, somehow the FBI seemed to miss that Mattachine was actually founded by former members of the Communist Party, but there are different reasons for that. FBI agents then paused their surveillance except for collecting the publications of both groups. By 1956, all of that changed. One, the magazine, published an intemperate article, here it is, or the part of it the FBI was very concerned with. The magazine claimed not only that gays worked in the FBI, but suggested, really only hinted, that Hoover was gay, by never really saying it directly. This kind of public charge led Hoover to target One and Mattachine using federal anti-obscenity law in an effort to shut down both groups. Long story short, the effort failed, but One, the magazine, did win a legal case about the mailability of its magazine, forever protecting the rights of gay groups to use the mail. During this effort, the FBI also came to target the lesbian homophile group Daughters of Galitas. Now, extant FBI records on Daughters are spotty at best, but they also suggest the nature of the FBI's efforts against early gay rights groups. Because men were commonly perceived to be the greater threat, a greater violation of gender roles in a patriarchal, hyper-masculine Cold War culture, gay men actually received greater scrutiny and focus than women did. Now, that's at least on the FBI side of things. The Civil Service Commission, I'm sure, was probably a completely different story. Nevertheless, the FBI surveilled members, tried to reconstruct Daughters' membership lists, collected its magazine, and was interested in where it opened new chapters across the country and in its activity at its annual conventions. FBI attention was also drawn to the East Coast of the United States when homophile groups formed there, including Mattachine, New York, 2 Mattachine groups in Washington, D.C., the activity of early gay rights activists Donald Webster Corey, and something called the East Coast Homophile Organizations, ECHO. In the interest of time, I'd like to focus on Donald Webster Corey. Donald Webster Corey was actually the pseudonym of a real individual by the name of Edward Sagarin. The Corey persona was something of a hero to many gays and lesbians in the early 1950s because he wrote this book, The Homosexual in America. This book was the first to offer a view of homosexuality that was in a positive light, that they were a repressed segment of society rather than some kind of moral, medical, or criminal deviant. Corey/Sagarin actually is something of an oddity in LGBT history. He was an early gay rights activist who wrote books and participated in activist groups. But in the late 1960s, as a middle-aged man, he went to college, ultimately took a PhD in sociology, and became an expert on deviancy, arguing that homosexuality by the 1960s was a pathology. One historian has described him as a Jekyll and Hyde personality between his Corey and Dr. Sagarin personas. What the FBI's files teach us is that Corey, the Corey version, in 1952 founded an early gay rights group called Homosexuals Anonymous. As far as I can tell, we did not previously know about this group. FBI records about the group and Corey also reveal the FBI's use of an informant, a therapist as an informant, who willingly offered the FBI information about gays. We know the identity of this therapist, a guy named Dr. Alfred Gross, because the FBI forgot to black out his name. There's Corey Sagarin, just once. Now, what I love about this, and I highlighted in yellow, where this informant, who's the therapist, Dr. Gross, neglected to delete his name. If you look at the bottom of the document, you can see how Dr. Gross described Sagarin, that he was cadaverous looking. I think that worked out great. Dr. Gross, it turns out, long cooperated with the FBI when it came to gays, and he worked for a group called the George W. Henry Foundation, a Quaker group that counseled young men arrested on morals charges. Now, the reality is they really regarded them not with any kind of sympathy, but regarded these as young men arrested who had some kind of pathological problem, a medical problem. So they were not really sympathetic with them. But Corey, or Sagarin, had invited Dr. Gross to speak before his group, which he did. But after doing so, he decided Corey's group was only interested in political rights and were rude and confrontational. He then promptly reported all of this to the FBI, including identifying for FBI agents that Corey, the Corey persona, was in reality Sagarin. So the FBI knew early on the identity of this major gay rights activist who, as was very common, hid himself behind a pseudonym. Also, in the interest of time, I'd like to focus briefly on the FBI and gay rights activist John Richard Jack Nichols, Jr. Here he is, front of the line here, picketing the White House. Nichols is well known because along with Frank Kameny, the two had founded the Mattachine Society of Washington, D.C., famous for its militant activism and, as you can see here, picketing the White House. But what's so interesting about Jack Nichols is that he was the son of an FBI agent of the same name, John Richard Nichols, Sr. Here he is with his second wife. I wondered, the FBI must have known, right? Junior, senior. How could they not know? I filed an FOIA request, Freedom of Information Act request, for Nichols' FBI file, which the Bureau claimed no longer existed. I then learned the Penn State Archives, of all places, at home, held an FBI document regarding Nichols. So after some back and forth, I got hold of it, and here it is. As you can see, it was heavily redacted. I don't know if you can make it out, but it does allude to somebody telling FBI officials all about Nichols Jr. Now, so I asked the question, I wondered, was his father involved? Was his father involved there? Was his father mentioned in this document? I didn't know because of the redactions, but I did note, if you can see it, at the bottom of that first paragraph, you see the name Richard in parentheses. Now, this is an FOIA request, FOIA release about John Richard Nichols, Jr. Why would the FBI put in parentheses Richard next to a blacked out name when his name is Richard? And I already knew the son went by Jack, the father went by Richard. So it was strange to me, and I thought this must be indicative of something. So I filed an FOIA request for this document with the FBI. After proving that FBI agent Nichols, the father, was deceased, hoping to get something. I wasn't sure if the FBI even still had the document, since they said they destroyed the son's FBI file, or would even release anything to me in any event. But to my astonishment, the FBI released this, which is the document unredacted. And what you can see here, and what we learn here, and this is in the first paragraph, is that Jack Nichols' stepfather, who was an alcoholic and probably drunk, called the FBI, outed his stepson, and then effectively outed his biological father as somebody who never told the FBI he had a gay son, or told the FBI his gay son was a major gay rights activist. To put it mildly, the FBI agent father got into a lot of trouble with Hoover's FBI. He was censured, placed on probation, and transferred out of the Washington, D.C. field office as punishment. I still don't know yet totally what happened to him, but hopefully we'll find out in the future. Chapter 7 covers the politics of homosexuality and the FBI with both the Johnson and Nixon administrations. The homophobia and concern with gays in government continued, most famously with President Johnson in the Walter Jenkins episode, when Johnson's longtime aide was arrested on a morals charge in a Washington, D.C. YMCA men's room. This incident led to a wider effort to screen administration and White House employees, and even potential White House entertainment, to find any gays, highlighting the long life of the Lavender Scare. Anti-gay politics continued with Nixon, who uniquely and unsurprisingly took it to nastier levels. Nixon would, and this is actually really interesting, Nixon would, on the one hand, on tape, claim to be, quote, the most tolerant person in the administration when it came to gays. But he never hesitated to gay bait or use sexually related information against those he perceived as his enemies. For example, in November 1970, Nixon asked the FBI for, quote, a rundown on the homosexuals known and suspected in the Washington press corps. He also spread gay rumors about his own first Secretary of State, William Rogers, calling him, quote, a fag. He called someone he met at a White House function, quote, an obvious roaring fag, and commented on an Archie Bunker episode with a gay character, and Nixon said this, quote, God damn it, I do not think you glorify on public television homosexuality any more than you glorify whores. The most tolerant man in the administration when it comes to gays. Nixon's underlings also didn't hesitate to use gay baiting as a tool in their dirty tricks, whether spreading gay rumors or planning to donate money to a gay group in the name of a political opponent. The last chapter of the book explores how the FBI dealt with the gay liberation movement, the Gay Liberation Front, and the Gay Activist Alliance. Now, gay liberation was a departure from the muted homophile movement and even the militancy of Frank Kameny in Washington, D.C. They sought radical transformation of American society, cooperation with other radical groups, such as the Black Panthers, and a rejection of traditional gay subculture. They would use confrontational, in-your-face protest, unlike the homophile movement of the past. Here they are in New York City. The FBI surveillance was also a departure from the past. By the late 1960s, FBI Director Hoover had restricted the use of intrusive investigative techniques like illegal break-ins, wiretaps, and microphones. With public protest as a result of the Vietnam War at a height and close scrutiny on FBI activity, Hoover now found those investigative avenues too risky. Also, having reached the mandatory federal retirement age at the time of 70 in 1965, Hoover only continued to serve President Johnson because Johnson issued an executive order exempting Hoover from mandatory retirement. More reason for Hoover not to rock the boat, to keep his job. So by 1969, the Civil Service Commission could no longer easily fire a gay employee based on circumstantial evidence alone, making it actually more difficult for Hoover's Sex Deviates program to operate. Hoover, during the Nixon administration, which started in 1969, hesitated, therefore, with intrusive investigative techniques, but still provided the president with a wealth of political information. So when the FBI targeted the Gay Liberation Front and the Gay Activist Alliance, FBI agents primarily relied upon the work of informants. And they had no shortage of informants, believe me, when it came to gays, who provided gay liberation pamphlets, newsletters, publications, and all sorts of information. The FBI was especially interested in any gay liberation protests centered on the political conventions in 1972. The FBI had a difficult time, however, with the Gay Liberation Front. The Gay Liberation Front had rejected formal organization. It had no elected officers, no committees, no bylaws. It was anarchist in nature, which ironically stymied FBI agents in firmly describing its nature, function, and organization. They couldn't figure out who was who because there was no who was who. The Gay Activist Alliance, an offshoot of the Gay Liberation Front, was organized along more formal lines. They had officers, they used Robert's Rules of Order, leading FBI agents to better understand its activities and organization. But never was the FBI able to develop information from either group to purge gays from government jobs or disrupt the two groups. The book concludes with the FBI after Hoover's death in 1972 and Nixon's political demise with Watergate. Without Hoover driving it, the FBI Sex Deviates program essentially ended. The file to be destroyed in 1977, 1978. But it did continue its anti-gay employment discrimination. But even that ended by 1993 after a gay, fired FBI agent sued the FBI to win back his job. Now, suing the FBI to get your job back if you were gay, that was never done before, so that shocked, actually, the FBI. To make a long story short, Frank Bettino here, he won his case as a class action lawsuit, actually, which forced the FBI to end anti-gay employment discrimination and then anti-gay employment animus, except with the military, filtered through the rest of the intelligence agencies, the CIA, the National Security Agency, and the irony of ironies, it was the FBI, the trailblazer in the war against gays. They had become the unwilling trailblazer in ending anti-gay employment discrimination in the federal government. Thank you.
If you have any questions, please come to the microphone located in the middle of the room so that we can get those recorded. Thank you.
It sounds like, it's on? Yeah. It sounds like administrations representing both political parties during the Cold War era were, if not equally as hostile toward gays, both negative towards gays.
Right.
To what extent can you attribute that to the Cold War? To what extent are there other factors going on with both parties?
Yeah, absolutely. Both political parties, the Democrats and Republicans, were hostile to gays in government and gays in general. They both loathed them equally. I think that was a function of the culture of the United States from the Great Depression onwards. So it's not any surprise that one party would be different from the other. And actually, there's a certain irony here. All of this started in 1937 with the Franklin Roosevelt administration. And if any of you know your LGBT history, Franklin Roosevelt in the past was Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And in 1919, 1920, there was the famous Newport Navy gay sex scandal. He was behind that too. So yeah, there's no political affiliation that goes along with this. It's across the board.
You didn't mention this, maybe you did in previous books. Hoover's obsession with Eleanor Roosevelt and hinting at her being a lesbian.
Right. That's, I think, also a function of the culture of the times, that Eleanor Roosevelt didn't, to some people, seem to fit in with expectations of what a woman should be. Probably staying at home, having kids, raising the kids. She had this unique relationship with her husband, and she was powerful, and she spoke out. So it's oddly similar with Hoover, right? There's no evidence that either, I think, were gay, but these were the common beliefs based on stereotype, and stereotyping is not good historical evidence. Anybody else?
I'm going to ask a question.
Sure.
Since you are in Kansas City this evening, and Kansas City is unique because we have, over the last few years, developed the Gay and Lesbian Archives of Mid-America, which aims to collect and document the history of the LGBT community. In your research, did you come across any references to activism in Kansas City? And I ask because, for those that aren't aware, the FBI has had a long presence in the Kansas City area and had a very active regional office. So I would be kind of curious if you had any information you came across that was from the Midwest in particular.
Nothing that comes to mind. Of course, most of the activism, at least in the early 50s and into the 60s, was really restricted to the West Coast and the East Coast. But once we get into the gay liberation movement, that's spread across the country, primarily on college campuses and university campuses. There might have been, because there was a lot of FBI reports from cities across the country, just field offices sending in, here's what's happening at the local campus with the Gay Liberation Front. So there's probably something from here, but nothing that comes to mind immediately anyway. Yes?
Other than the last example that you cited with the court case where he won his job back, has there been any restitution for any of the employees of the federal government that have been fired? Any apology? Anything from the government that said this was not something we're proud of?
No. To put it simply. There has been a movement, however, to remove J. Edgar Hoover's name from the FBI building. Now, they plan to build a new FBI headquarters outside of Washington in the suburbs. And as I understand it, the name will not be on the new building, which is probably appropriate. But what they will do, I actually don't know. That's as close as we get, I think.
Can you tell us more of the story about how the files were destroyed, why and how they were destroyed?
Right, yeah. The Sex Deviate program file dates from 1937 up through the 1970s. Now, when Hoover dies, 1972, he was the driving force behind it. And when he's out of the picture, FBI agents, FBI officials, they don't push it so much anymore, and times are changing anyway. And the FBI as an organization is responsive not only to the whims of whoever happens to be FBI director, and Hoover's gone, right, after 48 years, it's also responsive to changing political winds, right? It is a political organization in Washington. So why is it 1977, 78 when they destroy these files? The Carter administration's in office, and Carter's proclaiming human rights. Right? He's actually the first president to be friendly with gays and lesbians and gay groups. He's the first president not to denigrate them. He never really does anything proactively to help them, but there's this new attitude, at least with Carter. So I don't think it's surprising at all that in the 70s, suddenly the FBI wants to destroy 330,000 pages of evidence of what it did, which doesn't exactly live up to human rights. So it's 77, 78, it's destroyed. And if you're wondering why, well, how can we know anything about it if the file was destroyed? The reason we know something about it is there was a general description left behind by the National Archives, who actually surveyed the files and then gave their approval for its destruction. And on the FBI side of things, what they did was to copy documents into the Sex Deviates file. So the individual case files on targets still exist in many cases. but you just have to know the file number that's written in the margin of an FBI document, which is just a cryptic series of numbers, doesn't say Sex Deviates file. So they're out there. The problem is you have to know, right, who was targeted. You have to prove they're deceased to get their file through the Freedom of Information Act. So it's a very, very laborious task and impossible, actually, to reconstruct the entire thing because the index no longer exists.
Another Kansas City question. The former police chief became the director of the FBI, Clarence Kelly. Any perspective on his involvement after Edgar Hoover died?
After Hoover's dead, nothing happens with it any longer. I discuss this a little bit in the book. Anything after Hoover involving gays, gay rights, it's usually gay rights groups putting pressure on the FBI to end anti-gay employment discrimination. And the FBI typically writes back, oh, we don't harass gays, we don't do anything. And that's basically it. So they stopped targeting proactively, but the anti-gay employment stuff is still there until 1993. Yes.
You mentioned earlier that a big part of the FBI starting to make this investigation or the war was because of a kidnapping.
Right.
And I wanted to know, did all those kidnappings lead to death? Were the kidnappings public knowledge during the Depression? And then my last question is, was there a decrease in the amount of children that were kidnapped once this war began?
Right.
Thank you.
Actually, there were studies, scholarly studies actually made of crime rates during the Great Depression, and there was no increase in crime rates. This was all a perception, just a popular public perception that children were being targeted, a belief that was not true, that child kidnappings and murders had increased. It was just a media focus, a public focus. So there was no increase in crime. Those who were kidnapped, both boys and girls, not everyone obviously was murdered. Some people were released safely. But this is a typical thing with the FBI and the American public. When children are involved, right, people become very, very concerned, and somebody has to be held responsible. And given the cultural dictates, the social dictates at the time, it was widely believed that gay men targeted children. That's what they did. So even though there's a large category of child predators, among whom gay people do not belong, given stereotypes, that's who was targeted for years and years and years.
Can I ask one more question?
Sure.
Can you tell us something about the picture? Because is the man on the far left an FBI agent? Because I thought Hoover had a hang-up about facial hair on men. And the second question is, have you been to Hoover's grave?
I have not.
You know
been to the, I know where it is. I just never made my way.
You know the ultimate irony.
I do know the ultimate irony. Yes, Hoover's in the middle. To Hoover's left is Clyde Tolson, allegedly his lover and his associate FBI director. I'm not sure exactly who it is on the other side. That is an FBI official. I don't know his identity, but I don't think Hoover was quite that strict with facial hair.
Do you know who is 4 down from Hoover?
4 down from Hoover? No.
Leonard Matovich, the Air Force person who was given a medal for killing a man in Vietnam and thrown out of the Air Force for loving a man.
Oh, okay.
And it's just the ultimate irony that they're there together forever.
Yeah, well, there are lots of ironies that go along with Hoover. I think it's just generally ironic that he's remembered this way, given everything that he did, whether or not it's true, right?
Will you talk a little bit about how you first became aware of this FBI organization, their investigation, and did you face any particular challenges in getting these kind of documents other than what you've already stated in putting this book together?
Right. My doctoral dissertation was with the very long title that you heard, J. Edgar Hoover and the Anti-Interventionists. This is a book about the FBI monitoring President Roosevelt's foreign policy critics. One of those was the chairman of the Senate Naval Committee, Senator Walsh. So that was actually in my dissertation, and I wondered, well, what else did they do? And I knew stories about other cases, Sumner Wells and the Cold War cases, and nothing had ever been written on it. Nothing substantial, a little bit here, a little bit there, individual pieces, one chapter of entire books. And as an FBI historian, right, I can't leave something unturned. So I started researching this, and well, it was a monumental task. One, because the Sex Deviate file was destroyed. And so there was no way that was ever going to be reconstituted again. I thought, how can I possibly explain this not having all of the documents? So I accumulated, I think, I'm sure there are other things out there, but I think every extant document there is on this, including, and this was just serendipitous, talk about difficulties in finding research material. The Sex Deviate program file was destroyed, including all documents about it, except for some documents that indirectly referenced it. Where you have documents in other files that say there was a Sex Deviate program file and very vaguely described what it did. And when I was in Washington, D.C. last year, actually, doing my last bit of research for this book, it turns out there's a man there through a law firm who was suing the FBI through the FOIA to get documents about this. And I thought, okay, well, I have these already. And I met the guy, he showed me this document. It was the FBI Sex Deviate program policy document, the document we thought was destroyed. Somehow they got it from the FBI. I don't know how it survived, but it described in detail how the program worked, everything I told you today. So it was just dumb luck. I was actually worried, how am I going to explain the program itself in chapter 4? I don't have this document, and boom, there it is. So it's just good luck in many cases. The other thing is getting around the redactions, right, as you can see. And also it's just good detective work. You have an FBI copy of a document, but we know, right, the FBI sent documents to the White House. So if the FBI document is redacted, well, maybe the one in the presidential library isn't, and oftentimes it isn't. And then you can make the connections. Or just somebody at the FBI forgetting to black out a name. That helps a lot. Don't tell them. Anyone else?
Can you, just one last, anything about the FBI, Hoover and Truman?
Hoover and Truman? That's actually very interesting. Hoover usually cultivated a close relationship with presidents, starting with Franklin Roosevelt, but it depended on the president. Roosevelt and Hoover were very, very close. Roosevelt and Truman were not close whatsoever. Eisenhower comes in, they're close again. JFK comes in, Hoover is not close with JFK for a very good reason. Hoover's nominal boss would be JFK's brother, and Hoover had a habit of bypassing the Attorney General and dealing directly with presidents, couldn't do that. Johnson comes in, very close with Johnson, very close with Johnson. Nixon comes in, they have a strained relationship, but still fairly close, and then that's it. It depends on the president. He didn't like Truman. He actually undermined Truman in many ways.
Dr. Charles, am I correct that when Hoover died, his longtime secretary
Right.
destroyed a lot of his records?
Yeah, there was the famous secret files of J. Edgar Hoover. These were his office files, and this was one of the clever ways he got around FBI files being subject to court discovery motions. A lawyer would ask through a judge for the FBI to release somebody's FBI file, and the FBI, Hoover would say, well, the official files of the FBI contain nothing about this person. That's because that document was not in the official files, it was in his office files. And that's what was destroyed. There were two of them. One of them was destroyed almost totally by Helen Gandy, his secretary. The other one survived, so we can reconstruct a lot of that. But that's how he operated, very, very cleverly.
Thank you, Dr. Charles, for being with us this evening.
Thank you.